Welcome to Activate Your Introvert, the podcast for entrepreneurs and leaders who want to improve how they work with their whole team to get more productivity and creativity. It's been a funny week here, people adapting to different work patterns. Lockdown may or may not be about to be lifted, and I had a number of conversations about difficult conversations. Are they worse for introverts? How can introverts make them less unpleasant? As a result, I interviewed Clare Haynes of Wildfire. Clare is an expert in conflict and handling those difficult conversations. And I asked Clare for some tips on how to make them slightly less unpleasant. But just before we get to the interview comes the commercial break. If you want to talk to me about today's topic or anything else relating to introverts, feel free to call. Details are at introvertinbusiness.co.uk. I'd love to talk to you. If you enjoy these podcasts, please leave a review on the iTunes Store or podchaser.com. Details are on the sleeve for this episode. I'd love your feedback. The chances are you can't go through life without having any difficult conversations. Conversations you'd rather not have. That might be feedback with the boss, giving feedback to your team, listening to your employees, or even family. According to the Chartered Management Institute, 66% of people feel stressed if they know a difficult conversation is coming up. The discussions I was having were, are difficult conversations more difficult for introverts? My first thoughts were, yes, of course. But is that really true? So let's put to one side first and accept that some people happily start and enjoy, perhaps, difficult conversations. They dish out feedback and don't listen to other people. I think, completely honestly, they are rare and they're probably in some way got narcissistic tendencies. But for the vast majority of people, introverts, ambiverts and extrovert, difficult conversations are always difficult. So what makes them difficult? Lack of confidence or fear? Too much time looking inside ourselves and imagining the worst? Or just avoiding the issue until it explodes? I don't know. Now, I don't believe that introverts are unconfident, or at least no more than anybody else. We may be more choosy where we spend our people energy, but that's not the same as lacking confidence, although it leads to a faulty common assumption. We are better at looking inside ourselves, hence the word introvert. And of course that could be a problem if it causes stress and we don't deal with the issue. But as the conversation with Claire points out in a moment, it could also be an advantage if it helps us to prepare and keep the excess emotion out of the conversation. Introverts, of course, might be less willing to share personal feelings. That may or may not be good. I guess really we're no worse off, but ideas to help introverts with difficult conversations would be good. So I think it's time to introduce Claire. Welcome, Claire.
Hi, John.
Great to have you with us. Let's just quickly start off with why these conversations, why are they difficult?
The problem with the difficult conversations is actually more to do with our perception than the reality. So it's what the story is that we make up in our head. And that's when, in fact, we make it even more difficult, because you might have two people that perceive it as a difficult conversation. Their own perceptions of it differ from the other person. So we're almost doubling the difficulty sometimes.
Wow. And I guess if you add on to that, there's a lot of emotion in some of these discussions as well.
Absolutely.
Well, no, that can go both ways. If I'm having a difficult conversation and somebody's disciplining me or giving me feedback, I might not like what I'm being told, and that's going to be an emotion. And you just talked about the two-way nature and the problems of it. If I'm the one that's having to provide the feedback, maybe there's emotion on my side because I'm worried, am I good enough? Can I handle their reaction? Emotion rushing around all over the place.
It is. It's really difficult because we try to sometimes guess what's going on with the other person. And just how you and I went to watch a movie and then someone interviewed us afterwards to explain what did we think we'd just seen, we would tell different versions. Even when you know accurately about what's going to happen, you both do, you'll have different versions in terms of your emotion, your perception, your anticipation. And anticipation, as you say, can go so against us because we are predicting what might happen rather than using our brain resources the best right now.
Thinking what introverts can be like sometimes, which is where we'll prepare and the internal processing thing, where we'll think things through beforehand. And I guess the more you think it through beforehand, the more we are, exactly as you just said, in that space of imagining what it might be like.
Yeah, there's something about flexibility. So the planning is great because that gives us confidence and it gives us structure. And as you say, introverts are often, they have that as a complete strength. By doing that planning and creating some structure, you're also removing some of the emotion because you're dealing with the facts. So in terms of getting the best out of the conversation, it's about being able to be in the now, to be present with the other person. And whilst you have that structure, to obviously communicate that structure with the other person, that can be an advantage to them, but it also tells them where you're expecting the conversation to go. Also being flexible around that structure. So if that's your structure, that's your idea of where it's going to go, that's the information that you've used based on what you know. Because we are the types of beings that we are, and particularly if it's a tricky conversation, the odds are someone is going to throw in a curveball. It's not going to go quite how you plan it. It's largely going to be about the link or the joining in the middle, the bridge of the different styles of the two people. If you have an introvert and you have an extrovert, or you have two introverts, the dynamic will always be different. And of course, how far along the spectrum is that person that's an introvert and an extrovert, for example. It's not just kind of, opposites or black and white. It's the thing about a tricky conversation, that it's always going to be grey, because like you say, it's a mixture of dealing with information and emotion. The awareness of our own emotions around it is really important, and just recognising how we have different styles from other people and making allowances for those. Often we kind of have this conversation about styles or introversion and extroversion, that as if there's a right and a wrong, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. If we can be accepting of we're just different, and how can we work with our differences? How can our differences be an advantage? How can we learn? Because we may not like it, but we do tend to learn from almost everybody that we meet. It's about taking that on board and it not just being about the situation or how we perceive it. It's about making those allowances and making the allowances to at least be a bit more flexible than our natural style might be.
Some flexibility, being aware of how our differences can be an advantage rather than the other way around. But some of these conversations, very often people put them off. I know that I've got to say something, and it might be at work, probably, because that's really what we're talking about. Equally, I've known in the past when I've been about to have difficult conversations with girlfriends or whatever it might be. He says, trying not to go too far down that avenue. Very often people put them off. Do you think that's a good idea? Should you avoid them?
The difficult conversations in general?
Yeah.
I think one is a matter of timing. If we know something has to be dealt with uncomfortably, some of us might react by procrastinating and putting it off. And some of us might go like a bull in a china shop to get it done because it's uncomfortable and we don't want to do it. And so it is about going back to doing the planning, but also noticing, like you say, that, there is an opportunity here. There's a phrase called rupture and repair, which is used in therapy. The idea being that if you have, say, for example, a difficult conversation, or you have to receive some feedback that is negative, or we like to say constructive, let's face it, we take it on board as negative. By someone being really honest with you about how you might improve something, then you improve, and there's an opportunity for the relationship to be stronger, because as a result of that feedback, which may well have been brave, sometimes we think people like giving harsh feedback, but the majority of us aren't comfortable about that because we know it's going to generate a reaction on the other side, and we know how that feels. So it's quite bold and vulnerable to receive feedback and to give it, and to ask for it is one really good thing that introverts can do, in terms of they're good at absorbing information generally, because they're good listeners and because they often like to deal with information. They're good for asking for negative feedback, and the way where it won't seem negative or it won't seem risk averse or whatever is just to ask what can be done better. By asking for what can be done better in a neutral stance is just an open invitation, and often someone will be tentative, but as they recognise that you're open to receiving what they're prepared to give and you're thankful for it, they will then give more of it. And so this is where the rupture and repair comes in. You get a bit of rupturing because it's a tricky conversation and maybe because it's hard to hear, but the repair comes in because the rapport that's built and the trust that's gained as a result of the opportunity, through being grateful, through being able to take it on the chin, the fact that you're absorbing it, the fact that you're listening, the fact that you're qualifying what someone's saying to you, as in their opinion matters. It can actually be a much greater opportunity than we thought it was when we were fearful about what might happen.
If there's a difficult conversation going on, it's about both people's mindsets, both the giver and the receiver. It can be difficult in both directions, and so both people need to be aware of that. We've only got a minute or two left, Claire, but if I said to you, give us your top tips for handling those difficult conversations.
Certainly for introverts or for anybody, to paraphrase and double check what they think they've heard, because it qualifies to somebody what's actually happened in the conversation, and you get the opportunity to have an agreement rather than any assumptions. To relax the body and the face, because even if you're feeling uncomfortable, even if it's on the phone, the other person can feel that energy, and you will put them at more comfortable position. And agree what information is necessary, perhaps. So sharing relevant, agreed, needed, proportionate, useful information. So it might be that you send information out afterwards or in advance. Definitely demonstrating the empathy and intelligence by dealing with the right information and agreeing what that is, and asking for feedback, being brave with it. That can make a real difference.
So summarise what you've heard, he says, summarising what I've just heard, which, let's be honest, most introverts are good at. Relaxing the body and face, that's a nice one. Agreeing and information sharing before and afterwards, which I think is a really good point. Thank you. Any others?
I think it's very much about just being flexible, being aware that your plan is not likely to be able to be stuck to, because, as you said, you're dealing with two people, and seeing the conversation actually as that bridge that I mentioned, seeing it as the bridge, and that your aim is to form the bridge and to reinforce the bridge, so that it's not about two people, it's not about two sides, it's actually about building something together. By seeing that, it kind of can feel that the pressure is off, but actually that it's going somewhere positive, rather than it being, if it's perceived that way, that it might be uncomfortable or a bit of a battle.
View the whole conversation as building a bridge, because you're building something completely new. Thank you, Claire. Really appreciate your time today. If some of the listeners want to get back in touch with you, what's the best way they can do that?
The website is wildfireatwork.co.uk. The details are there.
Thank you once again for your time. It's been great to talk.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to Activate Your Introvert, and I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'd love to see your reviews on the iTunes store. Thank you once again, and catch up with you next week.